Once again, we welcome you back. You're watching 5 Talk Street. I'm Scott Murray. Joining me now is Don Young. He is the founder, artist, technician, and consultant with the Don Young Glass Studio. Don, good to see you.
Hi, Scott.
Tell the world out there what that is all about, Don Young Glass Studio, for the folks that might not know.
Right. Well, we started out back in the early 70s as Spectrum stained glass.
Long time ago.
Yeah, it was. Nearly 40 years in 2013.
Very good. What was the incentive initially? You know, I remember what was going on in the 70s. I'm old enough, unfortunately, to remember those days. Good times in the 70s. What was it that, you know, we've got to start this? Where was the incentive?
Well, I was actually a student in music school, and I took a summer job at Smith Stained Glass Studios, which was the big studio in town at the time, one of the only ones, and they did a lot of church work. So I had more or less an apprenticeship with them over the summer. And rather than go back to school, I stayed with them for 3 years, and then I started my own business in 1973, and we're still in business nearly 40 years later.
Now, I don't know what it was like back in 1973 in that particular business, but I wonder, there's so many businesses like this or arts like this where that it's lost. That trade is lost, and you just don't see people doing that as often as they did. Has that become the case here? Are you one of a select few that are still doing these things, or are there a lot of people out there?
Oh, no, there's very few now. In fact, I've outlived most of the competition these days after having been in business for so long. But it is more or less a dying art to some extent. There's very few people that do this style of stained glass and etched glass. There's still a few people who do it just for as a hobby, more or less. But we do it for business, for commercial buildings and churches, which is our main focus, and also a lot of residential and public businesses like corporations and even bars, restaurants, and things like that.
Is there one that comes to mind that you remember you're proudest of? You said, I'll never forget the time I created this, and boy, it's still 30 years later one of my favorites, or something like that?
Let's see, back in the late 80s, I was offered to do a project for the Dallas Public Library Children's Center. They had redone their children's library in that late 80s, and it was a brand new opportunity to do something different. It was called photo etched glass, and that is we etched the figures of actual people on glass, and it's so realistic when you walk by it you think someone's really there. So that was a great plum project to get, and it won a bunch of national awards, in fact. And it pushed me and it challenged me to do some things that I hadn't done previously. In fact, we were kind of the pioneers of photo etching, which has now become a little more commonplace.
I was going to ask you about some of the challenges you mentioned. Is there one thing that to this day remains challenging? I'm sure the economy, it affects us all in some way, shape, or form. But other than that, are there other challenges that you face on a daily basis with what you do?
Well, there's the art side and the business side of the same business. You know, so it's always a challenge to find clients that are willing to spend the money it takes to create a beautiful stained glass window, for example. So we're constantly having to advertise and do promotion of one sort or another to reach out to these churches. For example, churches are pretty much our main business right now, and there are, just in Tarrant County, there's tens of thousands of churches. And there are new ones coming on every day, and some other ones that may be going out of business, so to speak. So we're always looking for those new projects to keep ourselves in business.
Some of the more modern churches, you just don't see, unless it's maybe a Roman Catholic church where it goes back with a legacy that goes way back to Rome and so many centuries ago. You don't see as much stained glass as you did at one time. I remember as a kid growing up, you couldn't go by a church without seeing stained glass windows, and that's not the case that much anymore. Why have they gotten away from that?
Exactly. I think starting in maybe the 80s, the stained glass more or less went out of style. In fact, that's when I got in more to etched glass. I actually produced a very large etched glass window for a church in Dallas a few years ago. But I think things go in cycles, and the old style of stained glass, the original lead and glass technique that's been around over 1,000 years, is still popular. And some churches want to go back to their roots, so to speak. And it comes and goes. But as far as design, some churches prefer a more contemporary design. Some prefer a very traditional design. So we work with them in whatever they need. You know, if they prefer modern, that's something we can do, or contemporary, or something very old-fashioned. So we can do that for them as well.
What is, you've mentioned some of the things, but I think to myself, having been in television news for 30 years, and then I think about how the cameras were, and I got involved with television when film was involved, and then we went to this thing called videotape, and then it went to digital, and then it went to HD, and then it goes, now they're even talking about 3D. And I mean, you can see over the last 40 years how it's changed. And I just wondered, with the computer world that we're all in now, things that I'm sure when you started in the 70s didn't exist, now you have access to. How has that changed your business and what you do?
Oh, it's been a great help. On the design phase, for example, instead of doing everything by hand now, we may do an initial sketch by hand, but if we're going to scale something up, say from this big to a 2-story tall church window, it's very, very helpful to get the drawing scaled up in a much shorter time period. And also we can play with the colors and the design in many other ways on the computer. Most designing nowadays is done by CAD, computer-assisted drawing, which you can do very fine details very precisely. So that comes in handy on some projects. But for the most part, you know, you still have an artist with a pencil or a pen who's doing some drawing, and that's still a very essential part of the work.
Let me ask you, when you think about people like yourselves that are in a very specific art or a very specific vocation, do you ever have people call you out of the blue and say, you know what, I'd like to learn more about this? Would you be a teacher, or do you have young people or young students that you turn out to be a mentor of sorts for? If somebody out there says, you know, I'd like to, do you have a website they could go to, or someone could call you? Would you instruct them or teach them?
Well, I don't do classes anymore,
Okay.
although I still get calls occasionally.
Okay.
I kind of got my fill of that in the mid-'70s when we had one of our first shops on Camp Bowie. We taught classes. That's back in the 70s when crafts were extremely popular, macrame and beads and everything.
Right,
That's what
that.
There was a shop in Fort Worth that catered to that. But we actually taught classes then for 3 years and had 3,000 students over a 3-year period. So I kind of burn out a little bit on teaching. But I'm always looking for apprentices and helpers in my work, so I'm definitely open to that.
Do you have a website that you can tell us?
I certainly do.
What is that?
It's dyglassstudio.com.
Easy to remember.
Yes.
I've got 10 seconds. How many of these have you done in your lifetime? 40 years?
How many windows? Oh, thousands.
Thousands. And counting, right?
Many thousands.
And
yes,
counting.
hopefully
Don,
more.
a giant thank you. Continued
Thank you,
success.
Scott.
Thank you so very, very much. And thanks to all of you as well. We thank you for joining us for this edition of 5 Talk Street. Till next time, I'm Scott Murray. Have a great day, everybody.